Do you consistently do good things? Often we're not consistent, or we're not consistent in doing the right things in our life. So how do we break that cycle? Well, today we continue looking at the life of Joseph and see the consistency of his behavior and what we can learn from it. Let's check it out. Well, good morning. We got two excited people. I heard a woo and a start of a clap that didn't catch on. But hey, we're so glad that you are here today joining us. And man, I don't know about you, but it's a little chilly outside. Okay, anybody? All right. Some of you are from other places and are wearing short sleeves. I am freezing. We had a community garden day yesterday and we came out at 8:00 and there was frost on top of the beds. And I was like, what is this foreign substance that we don't see in Phoenix very often? It was a little chilly, but hey, we are so glad that you are joining us today. As Scott said, a little bit reminder of if you are new, we'd love to meet you out at the tent right after service. And we have a little gift for you. But we want all of you, if you've kind of come in this last season, you haven't plugged in a Cross Church yet, and you've never been before, next week we have our Pizza with the Pastor right after service. And that's what we do. It's really simple. We say, here's what Cross Church is about, and here's how you can be involved. So you can scan the code, you can sign up for that, and we encourage you. We'd love to see you there. But today, we're continuing on in our series, Living the Dream. And we've been talking through and kind of studying through the book of Genesis. And as we come to our passage today, and I was thinking about this a little bit, one of the first things that kind of popped in my head, and you'll see how we got to this in a little bit, is one of the hardest things to do in life is to be consistent. And to do something with consistency. Right, maybe you can do it one time, but doing it 2 times, that's a little tougher. And doing the same things over and over again and getting a routine. And often, maybe we finally have some consistency in our lives and things. But usually when consistency comes easy, it's not always the good things we want to do over and over again. Maybe it's we're consistently have a sweet tooth and we want to eat that same thing over and over again every single night. I eat 4 Oreos every night. I don't know if and they have to be double stuff. That's probably going to be my downfall eventually, but it's worth it, right? I consistently do that very well. But even in not so funny and light things, we consistently maybe run to a sin or run to a habit, run to an addiction or a coping mechanism. But it's really hard to do the right thing, to do the good things in our life over and over and over again. Which leads us to our key thought today that we're going to see in Genesis chapter 40. And we're going to kind of see all over this passage, and it is this, that it is always the right time to do the right thing. Now you hear that and you're like, that's not very revolutionary. That's not even very smart. You spent time thinking this week and that's what you came up with. And I would say, yes, yeah, it's, but you hear that and you're like, that's basic, right? That's elementary. My daughter's in kindergarten and that's probably something she could kind of learn and repeat. And no, but here's the problem is that's basic and that's easy and that's simple. But man, is it really hard to do. And we hear that truth, that idea of it's always the right time to do the right thing. But if we were honest, there are so many times where I want to install this habit in my life. I want to start reading my Bible. I want to start praying. I want to start being generous. I want to start loving people. I want to stop getting angry at my spouse. But we try it for a little bit and then we just fall back into our old habits. Well, today we're continuing on in the story of a man named Joseph. And you have your Bibles, you can flip to Genesis chapter 40. And in Genesis chapter 40, we're going to see how the life of Joseph, how he continues to model this exact truth. How he continues to do exactly this and challenges us is how do we be consistent in our words and our actions? How do we be committed to God, not just 1 hour a week? Right? Or even maybe a couple mornings a week, but how do we build that? How do we faithfully follow him day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year? And as we examine this next chapter in the life of Joseph, I want us to ask this question, is what can we learn from Joseph's consistency of his behavior? What can we learn from this guy who always did the right thing at the right time and continually models this even in the hardest of circumstances? And in Genesis chapter 40, we're going to dive into this, kind of introduce this story in just a second. But if you haven't been with us, here's a little summary of how he's already kind of done this along the way. You see, Joseph was a guy who stood out his entire life. He stood out from his brothers, and some will say, you can argue it was favoritism by his dad, but some of it was also his work ethic. He was a little bit of a jerk to his brothers, but he had a special coat and a special position. But even when that kind of fell apart and he ended up in Egypt, he was in an official's house named Potiphar, and quickly he rose up to the top. He was this Hebrew who was different, who was more disciplined, who was something special about him, and his position reflected that. And then life happened and something else unfair happened and he got thrown in prison. And even in prison, instead of hanging his head, he just kept working, he kept trusting God and kept standing out from the people around him, and he was being promoted within it. Which leads us to Genesis chapter 40, starting in verse 1. It says this, that after this, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guards in the prison where Joseph was confined. Verse 4, the captain of the guards assigned Joseph to them as their personal attendant, and they were in custody for some time. You see, Joseph is still in jail, even though he didn't do anything wrong. And more people are coming in. And it would have been easy for him as these guys are coming in, even when he's assigned to him, is like, I'm just going to do the bare minimum. I'm just going to put my head down. Like every time I've tried to do something good and rose, it works for a little bit and then something terrible happens and I get thrown in a pit or accused of something that wasn't fair. He's like, it could have been easy for him just I'm going to put my head down. I'm just going to kind of coast. I'm going to just keep doing what I do. But instead, Joseph keeps trusting God. And he keeps looking for opportunities for God to use him, which comes to our first learning that I think we're going to see from the life of Joseph here, is in this first one, is that results do not always come today. Let's keep reading in our passage. Starting in verse 5, it says this, that the king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker, who were confined in the prison, each had a dream. Both had a dream on the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. I love how he just notices that. Verse 7, so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? When we had dreams, they said to him, but there was no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. You see, Joseph comes and he sees these guys are in distress. He engages in a conversation with them. He seeks God on their behalf. And then they begin to share with him. And check out how this kind of goes is they right after here is they start telling them their dreams they had and what's behind it and then why they're so worried about it. And in verse 12, Joseph responds to him and he says it this way. He says, this is his interpretation, Joseph said to them. The 3 branches are 3 days. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand and the way you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh to get me out of this prison. For I was kidnapped from the land of Hebrews, and even though I have done nothing, that they should put me in this dungeon. Here's what's happening so far is these guys have dreams, and it first starts with the cupbearer, and Joseph goes like, tell me your dream. Joseph's like, I have a good history with dreams. I had some awesome dreams as I was a kid that we're going to get to again. He's like, so tell me your dreams, and I'll seek God, and God will interpret them for you and kind of tell me through you. So he tells him his dream, and he's like, all right, this is going to happen. 3 days, Pharaoh's going to call you. I'm going to restore you to your position. It's going to be awesome. But then Joseph puts a little note here. He's like, hey, when you leave, remember me. And I love kind of this idea of that even though Joseph was very faithful in this whole time, is there still a little bit of sting here? He's like, I should not be in this place. He's like, I did nothing wrong to get thrown in prison. I did nothing wrong to be in my current predicament. He's like, and I've done things good my whole life. I should have better results than this. So when good things happen to you, because I know they're going to, because God told me to, don't forget that I helped you out. And after this, actually, then the baker goes to him. And he's like, hey, he asks for his interpretation of his dream. And I love this, that Joseph just keeps on answering things. And he keeps on helping people, even when it doesn't give super helpful answers. Because it turns out for the baker, it's less favorable. And because Joseph tells him that Pharaoh's going to actually kill him. And at the end of this chapter, in verse 20, we're going to see how all this turns out. And it says this, on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he gave a feast for all his servants. He elevated the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. All right, interpretation 1 is correct. Verse 22, but Pharaoh hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had explained to him. Don't be the baker, be the cupbearer. That's what I heard. Verse 23. This most tragic verse in this entire little chapter right here, in chapter 40. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes for just a second. And kind of think, and if you've been with us a little bit through this kind of journey of him, here's a little bit of idea and kind of catch up of where he was. When he was a teenager, he was a little bit of a punk, right? God set him apart, but he was kind of a jerk to his brothers. He deserved a beating, but he didn't deserve to be beat and sold into slavery, which is what happens. And he trusted God. He was there, and his brothers beat him up, sold him into slavery. Okay, bad situation. All right, well, you know what? He's like, that's okay. That's not going to get me down because I'm sold to this guy, but I'm just going to keep working hard. I'm going to show that God has his favor on me, and it worked. And he got sold to this guy Potiphar, and he became to this position of power. And all of a sudden, he is number 2 in this household. He commands the entire thing. It's great. And then Potiphar's crazy wife says, he raped me. And then what does he get? He gets thrown in prison. He didn't touch her. He didn't do anything wrong. And he's thinking this whole time, all right, okay, my brothers were jerks. I probably should have handled that a little bit better, but I didn't deserve slavery. But I learned from my lesson. Now I didn't do anything wrong. And all of a sudden, I'm in prison. And now he's in prison. And he just keeps helping people. He becomes a leader inside of prison, and then he's helping them and interpreting their dreams. He's seeing when they're in distress. He's listening to them. He's doing everything right. And then all of a sudden, their life carries on. Their life gets better. And it says they forget all about him. At what point when you're Joseph would you just give up? Like, dude, this isn't worth it. I keep doing everything right. I keep going down, and I should have, like you reap what you sow, right? Like I keep doing this, but whenever I go to take the harvest, it's just another terrible thing. And I take a little bit of steps forward, but then he takes about like 10 steps backwards. And at some point, he probably would have got so discouraged to be like, I'm done. A couple years ago, and it's been now 3 years that my wife and I moved into our current house. And inside our current house, we love it, and it's nice, and it's bigger than our old one because we've had more kids since then, and it's been great. But one of the things when I first walked in, and even my realtor said, is outside we have like a little planter box, and they have like kind of some spaces where the plants can vine up. We have 3 bougainvilleas, okay? Yeah, that's the proper response, okay? A bougainvillea should really be called a devil bush. They're the worst thing ever. I hate them so much, okay? They have thorns, and then when they like become pink and pretty, right? But then all that stuff falls off and blows all over your neighborhood, into your pool behind your house, and into your neighbor's pool, which I apologize to him all the time. I'm like, I'm so sorry. And he's told me a million times, yeah, I never had those leaves before they put those bougainvilleas in. I'm like, I'm sorry, man. 3 years we've had these, and I'm telling my wife all the time, we gotta get rid of these, we gotta get rid of these. And I'm like, please, let's find a replacement, let's find her. She's always ignored me. Yeah, but I like them, they look nice. Finally, bulk trash pickup happened over the last month, and they hadn't picked up yet. I'm like, this is my opportunity. The rest of my stuff is still out there. I trimmed all my trees and bushes. I'm like, I'm gonna rip these things out. Asked my landscaper, he's like, it's gonna be $200. I'm like, I can do this myself. I did. And I got some scars to prove it. But at some point in there, I was like, I almost like was gonna call him and be like, how much would you charge me if you come over right now and take these things out? And I struggled with those, and I did, and I ripped all those out, and it was just like this moment of satisfaction. And then I'm like, oh, this looks really bare. I got some other plants that are gonna look beautiful, and I planted them. The problem was I took out 8-foot bougainvilleas and put in like 1.5-foot tall little vines. And as I'm looking at that, I'm like, my wife's gonna be so mad. But it was just this idea of like, hey, it's gonna look beautiful one day. And it's gonna be so much better. I'm not gonna get stuck with thorns every time I try to trim these things. They're gonna smell nice, the ones I put in. They're gonna look beautiful. But right now, the results are a little bit lacking. And so often when we look at our life and we look at our relationship with God, we're like, God, I seem like I'm doing things right. Like I've been good for like a whole week, right? Like I am finally on the right track. Why hasn't it happened? In the life of Joseph, we just see this so clearly, is he really had reason to be frustrated with God in this. He's like, God, I'm doing it, but the results just weren't there. And we reap what we sow, as the Bible says, but often, here's the problem, is it takes a lot more time to get to the harvest than really we're patient enough to get to. And here we see with Joseph that he had to wait for these results to come. But we also, another lesson we learned from it as we continue on this story is that not only do they not come today, but also relief does not always come when we think. Let's keep reading in chapter 41. And listen to this, it says, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. All right, listen to what that happened. 40 ends and says, Joseph was forgotten. And then 41 starts with 2 years later. So I said, like, results don't always come today. And maybe you're thinking, well, like Joseph, they're gonna come in like a few weeks. They're gonna come in a month. They're gonna come in a little bit of time. 2 years later, nothing has happened, and the dude is still sitting in a jail cell. 2 years pass. But then all of a sudden, God sets a plan in motion. Let's start reading in verse 2, and there's a long stretch we're going to read here a little bit. And it says, when Pharaoh had this dream, this is what it said, is he was standing beside the Nile. And when 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds, after them 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. The sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows, and Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plumped up and good, came up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump, full ones. Then Pharaoh woke up, and it was only a dream. When morning came, in verse 8, he was troubled. So he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for them. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. Joseph's probably like, today? Why didn't you do that 2 years ago? Verse 10, Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards. He and I had dreams on the same night. Each had a dream, its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew slave of the captain of the guards was with us there. We told him our dreams. He interpreted our dreams for us, and each had its own interpretation. It turned out just the way he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. Verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent out for Joseph, and they quickly brought him from the dungeon. Now I want to stop right there for a second, because we get this really prolonged time of being forgotten. And probably in this time, as we said, I'm sure there was so much going through Joseph's head, like questioning, like, God, do you really have a plan for my life? God, you told me this when I was a teenager, like you would do all these amazing things through me, and then the clock is ticking, it's ticking, it's ticking, and my situation is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And then all of a sudden, God sets this plan in motion. And pick back up in verse 14, it says when they sent for him, this is so interesting. It says he shaved, they sent him from the dungeon. He's in a dungeon, okay? And then it says he shaved, he changed his clothes, and he went to Pharaoh. Now just take in this imagery a little bit. Because if you were with us last week, when he gets accused by Potiphar's wife of trying to sleep with her, we are told that he was a well-built, handsome man. He's number 2 in this entire house. He's a good-looking guy. He's a leader. He's in charge of everything that house has over him. And now we get a picture of him as probably a smelly dude who hasn't shaved in a little bit, chilling in a dungeon. They had like, we need to give you a bath and we need to shave your face before you can go see Pharaoh. When just a chapter ago, he had a crazy, wealthy woman trying to sleep with him, right? Like his situation changed drastically here But verse 15, he appears to Pharaoh and it says, when Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said about you that you can dream, that you can hear a dream and you can interpret it. And just listen, I love Joseph's answer to him. He says, I am not able to, he answered Pharaoh. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. You see, he gets cleaned up. He goes, he talks to Pharaoh. He says, yes, God, he does this. God speaks through me. Like, tell me your dream. And then after this, Pharaoh he goes and he tells him exactly everything we read before, that he has these cows come up and then these skinny cows eat the fat cows. And then these good stalks and this good harvest comes up. And then the bad harvest eats it all. And then Joseph responds, all of this kind of skip down to verse 28 of chapter 41. And in this is how Joseph responds after he hears all these dreams. He says this, it is just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the lands. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God and he will carry it out soon. Verse 33. So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by famine. Think of just how cool this story is. Joseph probably had every reason to be frustrated. And then if I was Joseph, I would have been frustrated. That why is all this time passing? Why am I just like sitting in a jail cell? Why is all this horrible stuff happening to me that I do not deserve? God, I've been faithful. I've followed you. I've done everything right. But he just keeps being faithful and keeps waiting for an opportunity. And out of nowhere, God opens up a door. And you see, that is so how God often works. And as I was reflecting on this in my own life, as some of the darkest moments of my life are when there feels like there's no out. It feels like there's not going to be an end. And then all of a sudden, that door peers open and the room starts to light up because you're like, oh, that's the path forward. And for us, so often when I think we reflect on this and think about it, is what is God doing in your life? Because maybe you're in a dark spot. Maybe you're in an area where you're so frustrated, where you're so mad, like, God, why hasn't this season ended? We use that word season a lot, right? Like you have seasons of good and seasons of bad, but sometimes it feels like the seasons of bad are so much longer than the seasons of good. You're like, God, why isn't it ending? Why isn't it going away? But you see, relief happens on God's timing. And here we see that Joseph just trusted. Joseph just knew that something was going to happen. And I love because it leads to this next point of it, that we kind of, as we go on these, that results don't always come today, that relief doesn't always come when we think it will. And then that kind of leads to the next one, is that rewards are ultimately dependent on God's timing. Pick back up in verse 37 of this chapter. And I just love this, and I kind of try to think, I know there's so much passage we're covering today, and I was like, how much of this can I cut out? And some of it's just too hard, because there's too much good stuff in here. But verse 37, Joseph tells him, he's like, hey, you're going to see a famine. But before that famine happens, you're going to have 7 years of really good stuff, and then it's going to be 7 years of terrible famine. So during the 7 good years, start putting some stuff away, right? This is like investing 101. Start putting some stuff in the barn. Start saving up because it's going to get rough. And in verse 37, it says, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And he said to them, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's spirit in him? And I'm wondering if that was like a rhetorical question, because he's like, you guys are all morons. I asked you about my dream before and you were not helpful at all. So verse 39, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, can we find anyone like this? He asked his guys. Then he turns to Joseph. Since God has made all this known to you, There is no one as discerning and as wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I, as king, will be greater than you. There's another sermon in here that I don't have time for today. But if we offer things and God shows us stuff and gives us an answer for it, sometimes you got to be careful with saying that stuff out loud, because a lot of times you're going to be the one to lead it, right? I always get some people like, man, it would be really great if we did this at church. Like Dave even talked about, he's like, man, it would be really great if we have a Celebrate Recovery. And luckily he was prepared to lead it when we said, I'm like, yeah, it's awesome. You're going to be the guy leading it and starting it for us later, right? And sometimes when God puts a burden in our heart and says like, hey, this is awesome. Like this is the way forward. A lot of times it ends up where God's going to kick us out the door later and say, okay, now go do it, right? I showed this to you. Now go do it. Verse 41. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, see, I am placing you over all the land of Egypt. Verse 42, Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand. He put it on Joseph's hand. He clothed him with fine linen garments and placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in a second chariot, and servants called out before him, make way. So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and no one will be able to raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt without your permission. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priestess at On. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Wow. Just picture that all for a second. See how much of a change that is. The kids nowadays would call that, it's like a major glow up. That's a thing. Go Google it. But this is like this crazy moment where in like kind of one conversation, almost in one statement where he says, this is going to be you. Joseph goes from that dude sitting, rotting in a prison cell to like snap of his fingers. He is number 2 over all of Egypt. He is vice pharaoh in what is going to be the most powerful country in the known world at that time. That's crazy, right? That's insane. That's nuts. And you look at the timeline of all this, and it just makes me think is how different would our lives be? And maybe how much more content would we be if we just trusted God's timing? And you see, easy to say that. Maybe you're thinking in the back of your mind, well, yeah, I would trust God's timing if it meant I was going to be vice pharaoh of Egypt, right? Like if I knew that's where I was going, it'd be easy to trust God's timing. But God actually does give us those promises in his word. God actually does tell us he's going to take care of us and he's going to cause us to prosper. Proverbs 32:8 says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. God tells us that I'm going to teach you and I'm going to be there right, kind of pointing you along the way. That it's not bad, as stuff isn't going to happen to you because I'm going to be there because I love you. Deuteronomy 31:8 says the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Here's the issue is so often we'll trust God for a little bit, but all of a sudden when we don't see the results start to come, or when we're in a bad situation, the relief doesn't come, we start to doubt. We start to get afraid. We start to get frustrated and we start to get mad and we're like, God, I know you said this, but I'm not seeing it, so I'm gonna try a different path. Right? God, it's not working in me, so I'm going to read this leadership book, or I'm going to join this cult, right? No, I'm just kidding. Or I'm going to join like whatever. I'm going to go do this stuff because I'm not seeing the results right now. And what we can learn from Joseph's life so clearly is here is we just need to keep trusting God, knowing he is sovereign, knowing he is in control, knowing he has a plan, and it's on his timing, not ours. Which leads to our last point today, is that riches are waiting on the other side of trials. You see, what we've seen from Joseph's life is results do come, maybe not on our time, but on God's. That relief does come, not on our timing, but on God's. That rewards do come, not on our timing, but on God's. And so do riches, not in our way, but in God's. Verse 46, it says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph left Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvests. Joseph gathered all the excess food in the land of Egypt during the 7 years and put it into the cities. He put the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance like the sand of the sea that he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. Now, a little kind of important note to do is this is the second time we get Joseph's age so far in his story. The first time is right before his brothers beat him up, throw him in a ditch, and sold him into slavery. We're told he's 17 years old. Now we're told he's 30. So for 13 years, he served in the house as a slave, and he was in prison. So for 13 years, he's going through this deep, dark season that seems like it's never gonna end. And there's some good times in that season, but then it's quickly followed by being knocked down a peg and all of a sudden going through a bunch of terrible stuff and destruction. And for 13 years, Joseph just had to keep trusting God. And God comes through in some cool ways. Look at verse 50. It says, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Before the years of the famine arrived, Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, a priest, had bore them to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh and said, God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. And the second son he named Ephraim and said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. You see, God didn't just give him riches and wealth and prosperity from a materialistic standpoint. He did get that position of power, but even in a bigger way, God blessed him and his family. And God blessed him and his family in such a huge way that he actually has 2 children that mean 2 things. One is to forget, that he could forget the trials he went through, forget all the hardship he endured, and then also to be fruitful. And you see, on the other side of all this stuff that he endured, we see this beauty where Joseph was able to forget his past and to enjoy the fruitfulness of his present. And here, I think we get such a beautiful picture of what heaven is going to be like. That in heaven, we're not going to remember all our mistakes. We're not going to remember all the sin and all the hardship and the hurt we endured here on earth. Instead, we get to enjoy the fruitfulness of God's labor with him. And you see, all this finally leads and here of what we're going to see, and kind of as I want to sum up all this kind of that has come forward, is this is our bottom line today, is that when we focus on the right practice, God will make sure you end up in the right place. And you see, this is kind of the study we get of Joseph's life. And the last verse of chapter 41 is what I want us to hear today and end on. It says that every land came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land. Here's the thing, everyone came to him. And I sound probably like a broken record for the last couple of weeks because it seems like it's saying the same thing over and over again, because honestly, Joseph's life says the same thing over and over and over again, is that he kept on trusting God. He kept on following God. He went by the principles of he was loving God, he was loving those people around him, and he wasn't worried about everything else that happened as a result. And so often we do the exact opposite. Of God, I'll kind of trust you in this area if my life gets better. Or like, I'll take as a cue that I'm going in the right way if I'm blessed in this area. God, I'll read my Bible, and then if I see something happen, boom, I know it's good. Or God, I'll be generous, or I'll say hi to those people, and if something good comes out of it, then I'll keep doing it. But if they're weirdos, I'm gonna run the other way, right? And it's like, we don't trust God fully, but we're like, God, it's like a one-sided relationship. Like, God, I'll do this as long as I see the results from it. But in Joseph's life, what we see is this guy who just put his hand to the plow and said, God, I'm just gonna keep working. I'm gonna keep trusting, knowing that what's happening around me isn't where I wanna be. But God, ultimately knowing you are in control, you have a plan, and Lord, ultimately I'm secure in you and nothing else. You see, when we see this truth, it fast forwards us to the facts in the New Testament that it's not by our works, it's not by our ability that we are saved, that we are reunited, that we have a home for us in heaven, but it's just simply trusting our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, knowing that he will turn our situations the right direction, knowing that he will guide us to the right place. And ultimately, we can find joy and satisfaction in him alone. Let's pray this morning.